Good morning. I'm Nick Knight. I'm the director of showstudio.com and I'm an image maker. And this is Ask Me Anything, which is something I've done in response to questions that have been left on my Instagram or Show Studio's YouTube channel, or Show Studio's Instagram, or I think even their Facebook. Just because I think it's polite to answer people's questions. I would do it in real life, if we consider this not real life. If somebody came up to me at an opening or in the studio or in the street and asked me a question, I would certainly try and answer it. So that's the basis that I do this on. If people are interested to know things, and I'm really super happy to tell them. So I'm going to work through a set of questions. We've got about an hour, so hopefully we'll get through a few. I will try and be as honest and direct and explanatory as possible. I've taken out any questions which might feel a bit sort of unpleasant or a bit kind of just insults, really. Because I do get some of those, and of course, I mean, everybody who has a social media account gets those. And they were quite hard to deal with, you know, why are you a fool, or why are you an idiot, or why, you know, what can you say? So really not trying to answer sort of negative questions in that way, but I will try and deal with issues which I don't necessarily feel that I have every bit of information at my disposal to be able to answer, but I will try my best, is what I'm saying. Anyway, without enough of this preamble, let me go on to the first question. I'll put that down there. And this is from somebody who left a question on my Instagram, referring to a Vogue shoot that I did some years ago. Here is said question and the image. And this person goes under the name of studio_CHLOKI, who has written incredible images. Wow, well, thank you very much. Is this a lot of post or maybe a slow shutter speed? Really stunning colors. It's this image that you see here, which was published in Vogue and is part of a fashion film that's just been re-edited and put up on Show Studio just recently. Was all done, there's very little post in this actually. It's all shot through chandelier pieces, or Swarovski classic chandelier pieces and bits of old glass prisms, and putting Vaseline on a sheet of glass in front of the lens. And then really you have your camera and you have a sort of prism in one hand and a sheet of glass with Vaseline on the other, and you sort of mix the two together. And then with some other limb I can't quite seem to produce, you press a shutter. So probably I had some help with this bit. So it's a really lovely old school combination. I mean, back in the sort of 1930s when there was a lot of Vaseline, or 1920s even, when there's probably a lot of Vaseline used on lenses to give actresses a kind of a beautiful glow and a halo. Incidentally, people used to retouch with pencil lead. So they would sharpen the lead of a pencil till it became dust, and they would rub that on the negative. Of course, the negative is, as you know, the reverse of this. So anything that's white would go black. So when they're rubbing black pencil dust on the negative of my shirt, they're making it sort of glisten and trying. So old school retouching was done with literally sort of old school techniques of pencil leads and Vaseline and sort of, you know, bits of glass just to break the light up. The image came from some images that I love. By a whole set of different photographers who photographed New York in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s. So I can't remember this one, whether it was Louis Farrar, probably. But it could have been Danny Lyons, could have been even Robert Frank, but an idea of a sort of city, in the way that city, certainly in those photographs, glistens and sparkles at night. And New York is an incredibly photogenic city. And it really sort of came from, I think it was probably Louis Farrar, who's one of my favorite photographers, American photographer, who did a lot of street photography in New York in the 50s, I think. Also, surprisingly, worked for some of the fashion magazines and did rather beautiful fashion imagery. But his imagery is full of beauty and melancholy and pathos, and just a sort of natural human conditions for many people living in the city. Anyway, so that's the first one. Try not to spend too much time on each question because we need to get through. Here's somebody who I take it is a young man, but I could be completely wrong and doesn't really matter in the end. Andre Musat, ANDREIMUSAT 10, who's asked me a couple of questions, but I'm going to answer this first one. It says, how do you cope with failure? Did you had times when you were feeling miserable, your work is getting nowhere and wanted to stop doing photography? Yes, of course. Andre. Of course, everybody gets that. Everybody gets, you wake up in the morning and the pressure of the day seems overwhelming, overbearing, that you can't really find, the sort of energy to be enthusiastic, that it feels, a really, you have a mountain in front of you. And it's some days that mountain seems impossible to climb. My answer would be that if you don't try, if you abandon, you don't try and climb a mountain, you will never, ever get to the top of it. And sometimes you just try to slightly more kind of, gentle and considered pace. It's really a question of putting one foot in front of the other. And in a way, you keep on going. So, yes, of course, I get days where I don't feel like I can cope, with the days where I don't feel like I can do what I'm supposed to do. And also days where, where you do fail. But failing actually is something that I think is really important as part of the creative process. I think failing opens up windows that perhaps we wouldn't otherwise seen through. So it opens up doors into sort of visions which we weren't expecting. So I, in a way, I heartily recommend failing as part of the process. And of course, when you start taking pictures, so the first ones that you take are usually pretty, well, they're not usually very good. Only a few times in my life have I had a photograph come out literally on the first click, which I then end up using as a final picture. Most times it's a process of working through things. And if you want to look at the first pictures you take that haven't worked as failures, then they're failures. And of course, you can think before the shoot, well, how am I going to do this? What lighting will I use? What props will I use? And some people draw it all out, and some people spend hours and hours now trying to imagine before they're on the shoot, how it's going to be, and therefore to sort of so that they know what they're doing when they get there, which never works. That's, in my opinion, a really, really bad way to prepare for a shoot. If you're going to go into a shoot, and you will probably be nervous in so doing, we all are. If you try and work it out beforehand, you won't respond to what's in front of you and the magic of what you'll see. So there are things that you could never imagine. I mean, even taking this scene, which is fairly mundane scene, it's a grey wall or white wall. I'm in a grey suit and a white shirt, but there are things, the way the light falls across my face, the way it catches on my pocket hanky, the gradation on a wall, which might be things which you couldn't have imagined before. And you say, oh, there's a clue into this image. It's how he stands when he does this. It's the sparkle in the glasses. It's the things you can't imagine. And that's what you should be responding to, not trying to imagine it beforehand to get rid of that feeling of anxiety before you go into a shoot. You can't. You can't, and you shouldn't lose a feeling of anxiety before you go into a shoot. You have to go into a shoot knowing that it's going to be not terrifying, it's not quite a word, but certainly, you can't prepare for something and you've got to do something where there's a lot of pressure on you. And you have to accept that pressure and you have to deal with that in an intelligent way. Preparing the shoot beforehand by working out what you're going to do beforehand, I don't think is the right way. I think you need to be able to be free enough to respond creatively to something. It's partly why in my films I don't storyboard. Why? Of course, I know what I want to try and do, but as I said, we did something with Lady Gaga for Dom Perignon a while ago, and the client quite normally said, can we see the storyboard? And I said, no, you can't, because there isn't a storyboard, because I'm going to respond to it naturally as I see it developing. And Gaga came out in this kind of incredible pink satin, I'm not sure it's satin, but a pink shiny dress that Nicola Formichetti had got for her. And, that's the picture, that there were reflections on that. This thing looked like a sort of, Queen Anne I, or it was an amazing vision that came out. I would never have been able to imagine what that would have been. And when Gaga's assistant threw the dress up into the air, which had a sort of 20-foot train on it, it became like a sort of balloon or a throne behind her. So the dress became the throne for her queendom, which is what we were creating. So you have to know what you're trying to get to, but what I don't recommend is you plan it out all in advance in a way, say, well, I will put my lights here and I will do this and this scene will move on to that scene. If you're doing a feature film where you're having to tell a narrative, it's a very different thing. But if you're doing a fashion film where it's about an emotional response to the clothing and creating a sense of desire and sort of, wonder and style and all those sorts of things, which is what fashion film's about. It's very different to a normal film, conventional narrative-driven film. then you really want to be responding to the clothes in front of you, and you don't know what they're going to do in advance. Anyway, so I hope, Andre, that deals with your question. Let's put that down there. So I had this one came in referring to a shoot I did with people who I had spotted on Instagram over the years. And I was just really taken with what they did. And this particular person, had was absolutely fine with putting real pins through her mouth. And she posted that on her Instagram, and I just thought it was an amazing image. So I asked her to redo that in the studio. So yes, I mean, it's exactly what you see. It's exactly pins going through a girl's lip, and I think not going through her tongue, but looking like they are. So this person, who is called Santiago, I'm not going to try and say this. So it's SANTIAGOVANEGAS photography. Has written, "Love the lighting. Are these pins for real?" Yes, they are. Some people deal with physical pain. They can deal with physical pain, is what I'm trying to say. So yes, it was for real. Okay, so then move on to the next question, which a lot of these questions have come in whilst I was doing my last AMA. So the thing is, I can't see the questions coming in, so I can only answer them on the next AMA. So if you are watching this and you are busily writing a question on YouTube, I can't see these questions until I finish the AMA. So I've got 3 or 4 questions that came in during my last AMA where people, I think presumed that I could see, and the question is being written whilst I'm saying all this, which I can't. So anyway, so this person wrote, and they go under the name of I1, who books the retoucher and what determines the choice? Well, it's not really, it's a sort of funny way to look at it. I've worked with probably 4 or 5 great retouchers over my career, probably starting right back with somebody like Steve Seal, who's one of my first digital retouchers. And then moving on to Alan Finnemore, then Tom Wandrag, and then Mark Boyle. It's a similar sort of relationship to that you would have had back in the day with your printer. So I had a black and white printer who was called John O'Driscoll, and I had a color printer, the brilliant Brian Dowling from BDI Color Labs. These relationships with your printer or your retoucher are incredibly important to you. And I probably spend more time with my color printer or my retoucher Alan Finnemore than I would do with anybody else. So you might spend days working on an image sitting next to your retoucher. So these days I work on a screen. When I work with the very brilliant Mark Boyle, he was tend to sit next to me. I mean, this is pre-COVID, so he would tend to sit next to me, and we'd go through the images, and he'd retouch them, and I direct him, and he shows me what can be done, and that's how you work on an image together. Of course, since COVID, it's all been on AnyDesk, and all via platforms like this, where he shows me an image on screen, and I comment across the telephone. So I choose, of course, I choose the retoucher because these relationships are very, very important to me. And the people that I work with, the retouchers I've worked with, have been brilliant and still are brilliant. Some have gone on to do slightly different skill sets, like Tom Wandrag, but who now works in a completely different area. Equally fascinating, but I won't go into that just now. So they're not, you choose, you don't have a different one for every shoot. You have one retoucher that stays with you, and they look at everything post. And I tend to sit next to them, and watch what they're doing on screen. And often when they're preparing the image, I will see things that they might consider mistakes or just part of the process, which will give me a way into the image, which I didn't see beforehand. So how they work on the file. And I will normally say to them, let's see the same file, this image file, really light and then really dark. And when you take an image really light, you see things you wouldn't see as normal, and you take things really dark you wouldn't see. So for instance, again, playing on the image that we're looking at now of me, if I took this image very dark, so the only thing you could see were the brightest highlights, all that would be left, as you can tell, is the white of my shirt, the white of my pocket hanky and the cuffs, and maybe something a little bit on the face. Everything else goes to a sort of beautiful nebulous darkness. That image is a new image, because you can't see that now. You can only see that when you start to work in post on it. Same thing, if I took it really light, you'd see details in my Kilgore jacket. You will see the sort of, the lapels very clearly, and everything else would go to white. This white wall, this black wall hair will go blown out. It'll completely change the image. You'll just see the black of my glasses. And both of those are fine. And you have different photographers who've worked in those sorts of zones. If you look at Lillian Bassman, for instance, great photographer, really great photographer. Everything was sort of either jet black or completely white, but blown out. When you have photographers who work in this sort of, delicate sort of, I can't think of the right word to describe it, but pénombre, you would say in French, which would be a sort of, a sort of melancholic darkness. So you have different photographers who work in different ways, and I will look at the same file, but taking it to both extremes. So I hope that answers your question. I won. Okay, moving on. This is again posted on my last AMA. Victor Abbey Hart. Do you agree technology is getting rid of sense of memory and tradition? Well, this is the question that we posted on the little asset that Zach, who designed the show studio, made. And it's a really good question. Do I agree that technology is getting rid of sense of memory and tradition? Yes and no. I mean, technology is changing tradition. Of course it will do. So new technologies like this, or like things you do on your iPhone, they are new technologies which take us out of the sort of tradition or the canon of conventional photography. So what I do on my iPhone when I'm taking a picture, I could never have done on my 10x8 Sinar or my Hasselblad or Mamiya or Rolleiflex. So back in the day, I would have not been able to do the things I can do on this. So yes, an iPhone is changing tradition, the tradition of photography in this case. And I would argue, and I have done, out of all recognition. And I have said for a long time, and rather provocatively, and I got told off this the other day, I said photography is dead. That my son Callum, who works with me at Show Studio, said, you mustn't keep saying that. It's not dead. It's just, when you say that, people, dismiss it. What I'm trying to say is it's not the medium that everybody uses now to create imagery. Of course, it's not dead. And I say these things slightly to be mildly provocative, but it is a sort of an idea that sort of photography isn't the main way we create images anymore, in the same way that the magazine isn't the main place we see fashion anymore, and the same way that designers no longer want to show their collections on the catwalk anymore. Not just some do, some don't, but there's a large move away from it. And I think by saying things like photography's dead or the catwalk's dead or it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek, I mean, obviously it's not dead, but it's a tongue-in-cheek way of saying there's been a fundamental change and we need to acknowledge that change and not just keep on laboring under the sort of assumptions of the past that I'm a photographer. Because if you start to really look at that and say, well, I'm a photographer and this is what I do, but then they say, okay, what film do you use? Well, I don't use film, digital, what camera you use? Well, I tend not to use the camera. I tend to use my iPhone. So what sort of photographs do you do? Well, I do sort of 3D scans of people, and you quickly are sort of having to describe something which is far outside of the very, very well-defined parameters that describe photography. So if you're describing photography to an alien, well, God knows why you would, because there aren't any. But anyway, if you're describing photography to an alien, you'd be able to describe it within the parameters, that have existed ever since sort of Maybridge and the early photographers created it as a medium, and then went all the way through. They joined Maybridge to Maplethorpe, Atche to Avedon. I mean, that's the same medium. Then you get to the kind of middle of the 90s and a new medium happens. And my purpose of saying things like, which are, I agree, slightly annoyingly provocative statements like photography is dead, is to make people wake up and realize that actually we've got a new medium. And it isn't to do down photography, it's to say there's a really, really exciting new way of doing things. And things like, I keep raising my iPhone, things like 3D scanning and virtual reality and artificial intelligence are the tools that we use now. And you don't want to limit that. And what I really don't like is that when people sort of protect photography and sort of say, well, that's all that new stuff is all fake, it's not real photography, therefore we dismiss it. It isn't photography, I totally agree. But why dismiss it? Actually, young creators should really be involved with this new technology. It's what's shaping our world, it's what's shaping our future, it's what's shaping our species. I mean, there are huge and fundamental changes happening to us as a species. And if creative people, I mean that in a broad sense, but if artists and people who work mainly creating visions, if you want to be a sculpture or film or opera or photography or image making or whatever it is, if they push the future away and say, no, it's all worthless and everybody just goes on Instagram to get more likes, or it's unreal visions themselves and it's people preoccupied with their own appearance and all this sort of thing, and dismiss it for I've heard so many slightly kind of unpleasant things said about new technology. I think that's really wrong, because then the people who will push technology will be the people who, and it's primarily the military. The military are huge funders of new technology, and a lot of the things that we use have been invented for the military. And then of course, big business, corporations and people who want to make a lot of money. So really the future is being shaped at the moment by people who are selling death, or people who enjoy greed over virtually anything else. Now, I personally think that artists should shape the future. I think that people who have a sort of more sensitive vision to life and humanity should be shaping it, and it shouldn't be shaped by people who are selling death and greed. So that's my feeling. I feel that very strongly, and that's reason I say things which are I feel are probably quite strong in that way, is because not to do down the catwalk. The catwalk's great, and magazines are, personally, I love magazines. The photography is a beautiful, beautiful medium. But if we keep on saying that's what we do and this is all we can do, etc., and we ignore the new things like virtual reality, augmented reality, NFTs, artificial intelligence, all the things which are shaping our futures, we leave it to our people to shape them. So that's the reason I say it. It isn't just to be annoying, although that's probably a byproduct of it. It is to try and make people motivated to understand that there is a new way of doing things, and there is a new horizon. I'm slightly cautious about going into this next little speech, because it's going to be, again, divisive. But if you read, there's a book called Nova Scene by a great author called James Lovelock, who is now probably 101 and wrote the book when he was 100, as far as I can tell, which is fantastic in itself. And somebody who's 62, knowing that in 40 years' time, there's a possibility that I might be still doing things as important as James Lovelock's work is to him and to people who read his book, Nova Scene. He talks about the fact that we have invented and we have created artificial intelligence that is advancing and forming and evolving 10,000 times at least quicker than we evolve. So you can imagine what that means. Within a few years, you are going to have an intelligence on this planet 10,000 times better than we are, or not better than we are, but more capable of evolving and adapting and getting more and more sort of prolific than we are. So, for instance, it's a bit how we look at the plants in the garden, how slowly they appear to move. Well, for artificial intelligence, that's probably how slowly we appear to move. So to sort of dismiss that and just write it off as science fiction or visions of a bleak future like that in Terminator is really to, again, disengage from it, to put our heads in the sand, or at least turn our backs on the future, and really sort of, and not be part of shaping it. I mean, what James Lovelock argues in Nova Scene is that we're not going to be shaping it. We've started it, and it's impossible to stop now. And we are going to be the second most intelligent species on the planet, which, being one perhaps should be humble and realize that that's what happens with evolution. So, I'm sure for sort of, early versions of humankind, Neanderthal and even less developed, they might not have wanted us, but we haven't become the most intelligent species on the planet, and we've to a large degree done amazing things. But if there's another species which is going to evolve through AI, then we have to not just look at that in a totally negative way, and we have to realize, perhaps with some sort of humility, that we weren't always going to be the most intelligent species. Anyway, that's a rather provocative and probably not necessarily well thought out statement, but it's something that's in my mind. And you know, I get asked these questions about technology. So I hope that's been some sort of answer. I think I probably answered half of it, but not the other half, but I should probably move on. Anyway, I highly recommend, and I've sort of recommend this virtually every time I speak in public, is that people should read James Lovelock's Nova Scene. It's quite a short book, beautiful to cover, and it's, I think, a really interesting book to read to try and work out where we are. Then somebody called, I think it's Del Plummer, because I see I can read that. Yeah, I think that's Del Plummer or Delhi Plummer, who wrote again when I was doing my last AMA, wrote, "Nick, are you happy in these strange times?" Well, that would imply that I wanted to be happy. That would imply that I'm looking for some sort of general feeling of happiness, as opposed to all the rest of the feelings that I'm capable of as a human being. So I'm not some sort of, I don't like the idea that I'm some sort of benign idiot that just looked for sort of a sort of happy time to sort of, you know, frolic around in as if I don't have a care in the world. It's not really a vision I want to have of myself. So I won't say happiness is overrated, because to be another one of those statements I have to defend. But I don't see life as working hard to get to a plateau of happiness, which is everything's resolved. Or what would you do? You know, one could argue that that's a sort of where the vision of heaven falls down. You know, why on earth would one want to just be sort of floating around in clouds if that's your vision of heaven, forever, for eternity, with no problems and no worries and everything's fine and lovely? Part of what makes life so precious and so beautiful and so important and vital is the fact that you have these ups and downs. You know, that 1 hour you can feel amazingly inspired by a painting you've seen, or a film you've seen, or a flower you've seen, or a friend you've met. You can feel in love and happy and accept, but then it's conversely, the next hour you can feel worried and concerned. Next hour you feel angry. Next hour you feel, you know, that you're full of anxiety. But then you find things, and it's this up and down that makes life feel so rich. My friend Simon Foxton once said to me, you know, life is not about the black and the white. It's all the shades of grey in between that make life so beautiful. Simon's a very wise man, but I agree with him. It isn't this sort of, you know, we have to be happy or sad. There are thousands of different emotional states, all interlinked, all interrelated, which we are capable of feeling. So I don't like the idea that I just want to be happy, but that's just a long ramble to answer your question. Are you happy in these strange times? They are very strange times. Very, very strange times. I'm 62 and I've never encountered this sort of thing going on. On the one hand, it's incredibly energizing and amazing and awesome. Some of the things which are becoming possible and are happening, and some of the things I've talked about. I think the pandemic in its awfulness, and I don't think we're out of it yet, so I don't want to talk about it as if it's something that's happened in the past, nor do I want to give it any credibility. A lot of people say, oh, what's the silver lining in all this? I read that would imply that there's a silver lining in this horrible virus, which it is not. But it has allowed people, forced people, given people the opportunity to slightly step back from their lives and to consider who they are, what they're doing, what's important to them, where they're going, you know, all those sorts of things. So it might have made it a very profound cultural change. It certainly accelerated the way that we deal with these interfaces. So, you know, I'm sure a lot of you will have been on Zoom meetings and Zoom calls over the last sort of a year and a half or so. I've used Zoom as a platform to create imagery, so I can, for purpose, take an image of somebody in California while I'm here, or in Moscow, or in Tokyo while I'm staying here. And although it's highly frustrating in the way that I used to be able to pick up a camera, be in the same studio and respond in that way, it's still a way of creating an image. And I think, you know, those sorts of things are quite fascinating. So, you know, there are new technologies which really are shaping our life, and the pandemic has forced us to re-look at what we're doing. In some ways, that isn't a bad thing. You know, I don't need to sort of go on, you know, like somebody who just realized the world's in an awful position. But, you know, what we're doing with our planet is dreadful and terrifying. You know, on the political scene across the world, from Yemen to Belarus to obviously recently to Palestine and Israel. And I tread really carefully when I try and say things, because obviously I'm in Richmond in London. I know nothing about the real situation on the ground in Yemen. And you know what you know from the news or from different blogs you might read or look at, which of course some of it is not true, some of it is propaganda, some of it is distorted. And I do post quite a lot of things which sometimes I get so outraged at what I see, and there's that awful feeling of sort of powerlessness. If you see this stuff happening, awful base atrocities that take humanity down to, to lower than bestiality, lower than being a beast, the worst form of ourselves, the worst form of humanity. And you see these things happening, and it's not that I'm sort of saying, oh, it happens in other countries. You see what the political class are doing in Britain. You see the injustice, the awful way we treat refugees and immigrants, the dreadful way that we behave. Our society, starting right here in London, is rancid with corruption and greed. And so, one can't just look at this stuff and go, oh, well, it's really horrible, but I'm not going to do anything. So you choose to do something. But what can you do? You can donate money to charity, and that's fine. But there's not the feeling that really things are getting solved that way. It really, you would run out of money fairly quickly, because there are so many different charities you should be donating to, for helping people with problems right across the world and right here at home. So, and also there are things that the charities can't touch. You look at what's happening across the world. It is incredibly. It really hurts. But what can you do? And the easiest thing to do, and one could say this is fatuous, or I think the word, I don't know whether it's virtue signaling, can't even say the words, or woke, those terms that get applied quite frequently. But all the same, I can't see that it's fine to see atrocities happening in Colombia or appearing to happen in throughout the world, and just look back and say nothing. So, well, that's horrible for them. I'm fine and reasonably fine here. So, I'm not going to say anything. So I use what I can do, which is my platforms of Show Studio or my Instagram site, to at least spread some of the things that I'm seeing, to say, look, this is unbelievable. And perhaps in so doing, galvanize some sort of critical mass that can change things. I don't know, how on earth do you stop some of the things that you see happening, but it's all the same stuff. It's power and greed and religion and racism. And, how can you stop it? So I don't profess to have any way, but I don't see the alternative saying nothing. I think just feeling sort of intimidated by people who call you woke or that you're virtue signaling. I'm happy to do whatever is the correct thing to do, but I could not tell you for the life of me what is the correct thing to do. And of course, I don't know the ins and outs of political situations in different countries, nor the real ins and outs of political situations over here, because you don't get that sort of information. So you can do what you can do, and making a critical mass of people who will try and change things in whatever way they can do. And some of the people who have the power and the wealth to do that, realizing that they also feel what many people are feeling, is perhaps a way of getting some things changed. Where do you stop? Anyway, so are you happy in these strange times? That was a very long, ranty answer to that. So I hope, Delhi Plumber, if that's your name, that was in some way helpful to answering your question. And then there's another one, which is from Shabona Studio, C9. What's the future of conventional photography, cameras, and technical skills? Well, as I said earlier on in this AMA, I don't really believe that what we do is photography anymore. So I think that photography will still go on. Of course it does. Painting still goes on after the invention of photography. And sort of classic analog photography is incredibly beautiful as a medium. And, in many ways, I would be happy to devote my life to analog photography. However, there are other things I'm seeing on the horizon creatively, which are more fascinating for me, which I'm naturally drawn to, and I go towards. But that doesn't in any way mean that I don't love photography, and I spend a lot of my time looking at great photographers. People like Frederick H. Evans, who I hope I got his name right, who photographed the inside of cathedrals. Just work which is is so beautiful. And if you don't know his work, please look it up. Please go and try and see his prints. A very good thing to do if you're in London, which some of you are, some of you aren't, is to go, when it's open, to the Victoria Art Museum and go to their print room and look at, you know, real prints from people like Walker Evans or Edward Weston or Ansel Adams, or, you know, some of the great, great, great photographers. So, you know, that the future of that, well, that's something that's happened in the past. One can try and find a way of that being important, and to some people, in a very valid sense, that is important still. It's just not really to me. And I think, you know, the zeitgeist at the moment is looking towards something else. But I really do not want to come across as somebody who doesn't like photography. I love photography with an absolute passion. I think it's a beautiful medium and quite unique medium. I think especially fashion photography is unbelievably unique in its skill set and what it achieves. But there are new things that I would personally, for reasons I said perhaps earlier in this broadcast, I would rather concentrate on. However, I've been in Scotland for the last 4 days photographing landscapes, but I've been doing it on my iPhone. So, yeah, it's the same subject matter as somebody like a sort of, you know, a Minor White or an Ansel Adams or a Weston or any of those fantastic people would have done. And I'm just doing it with a different thing, and it's a different medium, but it's the same joy. And, you know, I don't want to speak about this too much, it's early in the project, but I'm doing a series of images of landscapes and trying to find a new language for expressing the idea of a landscape. Or the idea of nature or whatever, but I'm right at the beginning of the project. So I had a fantastic time at somewhere really, really beautiful called Dunsky, which is a beautiful old Scottish house on the estate in West Scotland in the lowlands. And, you know, the ancient forests around this house are incredibly beautiful, and the landscapes are so inspiring. I came back the day before yesterday, really, really inspired by just this beauty that, you know, that Scotland, which isn't that far from where I live, offers. So, yes, conventional photography is still alive, still fine, still getting on, etc., etc. It's just in my world, it's not really where I see the future. And I think we'll look at it in many ways and as a sort of, you know, activity that people did 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or whatever. It's not really the activity we do now. But that's not true of everybody. There are still great and young photographers out there who are practicing and creating amazing stuff through conventional analog photography. So it's still going and still amazing. It's just not personally where I am at this moment in my life. Anyway, don't know if that helps. So another question that came in on the AMA from somebody called Warwick Orm says, who grows better roses, Sam McKnight or you? Obviously, me. No, actually, in all seriousness, Sam McKnight. Sam McKnight grows beautiful roses, and he has the most amazing garden. So I'm afraid I have to concede that growing roses, Sam McKnight grows most beautiful roses, and it's, you know, I'm often in awe of his roses. So moving on. Again, comes something that came in our last AMA from Jamie Ian Genovese. That's a nice surname. Hi, Nick. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for doing this. Question. When's the last time you saw an artwork that really changed how you saw or understood something? I read all the questions, obviously, before I do this. And I thought, oh, when was the last time? When was the last time? And I was wondering whether it was Frederick H. Evans. I was wondering if it was the photography of the man that photographed inside of cathedrals in Somerset or somewhere, hundreds or so years, 800 and something years ago. I think it was probably then. I think that was a fundamental change in me, and did spark something in me that was just, you know, this is what I'd love to do. You know, I would love to travel around photographing inside of churches and trying to deal, and I would be really careful on this one, trying to deal with life after death, religion, and those feelings of spirituality and all that sort of thing. I say be careful because I'm very cautious about talking about people's religions. I don't believe in God. So I come at it from the point of an atheist, but I admire people with belief. You know, I have some friends who are strongly devout. Some are well known, some are friends who are less known. But they are strongly devout and in different faiths. And I really admire that in somebody, but I can't for the life of me find myself believing because, well, for all the reasons that you might know. So And I actually think it's sort of strange that we live our lives, well, not all of us, obviously, but a lot of societies live their lives based on something they know nothing about. So, given the option, does God exist or does God not exist? Well, there's no evidence for him or her existing or it existing. And there's lots of evidence for, for life to be what it is about evolution and all these sorts of things. But let's ignore all evidence and live our lives as if there is a God. But even if you're going to take the sort of choice, all the evidence is over here and there's no evidence over here. So why would you do that? And I think there's something basic in us, or a lot of us, that we want to have this feeling of, this isn't our only chance. This isn't, that life, when we shuffle off this morbid coil, or the expression is, that there is another life. But I don't see any religion telling me that life or that existence is something I would like to be part of. And it's, I'm trying to be very careful on this one, because upsetting people because of my lack of knowledge of certain religions is not clever or something to be proud of. But what can you say? Look at the speeches of Christopher Hitchens. Anyway, point is, I would like to try to get back to the question before I dig myself an even deeper hole. What's the last time you saw artwork? Frederick H. Evans. Gentleman who photographed inside of churches. His pictures are beautiful, and you should look at them and try and see them as real prints. There is a book of his work, which is incredibly expensive and very, very hard to get hold of, but it is beautiful. And that, I think, is the time that the last time I remember seeing an artwork, if you want to call it that really changed me. And I probably saw an artwork of his at the Victorian Albert Museum or an exhibition in one of the big galleries in London. So moving on again. So again, from the last time, from Marie-Liesse Bernard, who I'm guessing is French, but I've got no idea why. Hi, Nick, what about the digital fashion of avatars in gaming, skins? Do you see it happening quickly? Yes, is the answer to that. It's where it's all going to be. I won't say very much about it, because there's lots of reasons I won't say very much about it, but yes, absolutely. It's very, very important, exciting, and definitely where we're going. Okay, and again, somebody from last AMA, Christopher Nettles. Would you recommend for young creative designers get themselves on a public circuit and get noticed by journalists, collaborators, and marketing companies outside of posing on Instagram? Well, let's take the word posing on Instagram out, or the words posing on Instagram, because that's a slightly sort of, you dismiss a lot of people who use Instagram as a creative platform, and there are some amazing people doing amazing images based on themselves that are on Instagram, and they're incredibly inspiring. It's just the conventional way to do imagery of that sort is, or used to be, to do it via a magazine. That's not what we do anymore. And people, there's people like Fecal Matter and countless other people I'm fascinated with, Ugly Worldwide, who are creating, this sort of almost complete vision of themselves. They created this world. And some are making clothes and selling them through this, but they're not using advertising campaigns, they're not doing catwalk stuff, they're literally working on Instagrams. I think that's really important. Like everybody, I have reservations of huge platforms like Instagram and Facebook. I don't have a Facebook account, I don't intend to have one, but I do spend a lot of time looking around Instagram and seeing other talents, which are great. I really find some amazing people, not only sort of people who post sort of old French films, but also, people who are creating images of themselves and posting on Instagram. There's some amazing people out there doing amazing things. Of course, they could be in Russia or Brazil or Nova Scotia or all over the world, but they create these worlds that you see. It's a bit something in between going into a film and watching the character of your favorite film, and something of what used to be a sort of fashion magazine where you see images coming in, and that's what my Instagram account tends to be. Is sort of populated partly full of things about science and physics and that sort of thing, which I love, partly about old photography, partly about old films, and also, but a lot of people who are creating these worlds on Instagram. So that's why the word posing isn't a particularly nice word. So that's why I pick up on that. But would you recommend that young creatives, designers get themselves on a public circuit? Instagram's a public circuit. I would recommend you work on that, to be honest. That's where most people are looking to find talent now. I'm not quite sure where else you go. I mean, you could go into magazines, but again, without opening up that old can of worms, people aren't looking at magazines like they used to. Of course, magazines are beautiful, but they're not where I'm finding talent, and not where I guess a lot of other people who are looking for talent are finding it. They have small circulations as opposed to vast circulations. They're incredibly, well, I'm not going to do a sort of disservice to magazines. I personally don't think it's where people should be putting imagery anymore, because I don't think it's fit for purpose. But again, it's like the catwalk and photography. I make these statements and people get upset, but I'm not trying to upset people. There's a better way. If you want to get through to 10,000 people, put your work in a magazine. If you want to get through 10 million people, put it on the internet. And the magazine will only put it on the internet in any case. So, I think you're probably right to do it online. But Instagram is one platform, and there are other platforms, TikTok or Facebook or YouTube, or there are other platforms you can get through, and these platforms allow you to put your vision on to a large degree without it being modified for somebody else's profit. If you work for, if you're trying to do a book, for instance, of images, your publisher might say to you, yes, well, I'll publish your book, but I don't want those images in it, and those are a bit too, I can't have it on the front cover. And actually, Instagram does not do that to you unless you cross the absolutely absurd rules about morality. Which is, excuse me, which is another topic I'll try and stay away from, because again, it's sort of slightly dodgy territory. But I find that the idea that you can show on Instagram a child that's been mutilated by some horrific bestial act of war, you can show that, but you can't show a woman breastfeeding, that's the very twisted version of morality. You can show any amount of guns and killing and death and weapons to maim and disfigure and kill, but you can't show a woman's breasts. I think that's a very sad indictment of morality. Anyway, not sure that's getting right on this question. So a little bit on that line. I'll try and answer this, but I'm not sure I've got the best answer for it. But it is a book that I've read recently called How to Be Liberal by Ian Dunt, which again, along with James Novoseline's, James Lovelock's Novosine, I would happily recommend. Anyway, Marilyn Cole Artist writes, I don't think being a liberal means the same as 3, even 2 decades ago. In today's society, different and not so good ideologies have adhered themselves under the liberal umbrella and in the name of causes otherwise just, as being liberal used to mean supporting civil liberties, individual rights, democracy, and free enterprise. Perhaps it depends on where one lives. Yes, it does depend on where you live. I would be happy and proud to describe myself as a liberal. That means one thing in Britain. In America, means something apparently completely different. So, I think, all the values that I would consider as great values, humanitarian values of, not believe, being anti-racist, for instance, is a liberal value. Tolerating people, trying to sort of realize that we are all different, but at the same time, we are all, we have all the same worth. Those are what I would call liberal values. And you could just take the word liberal out and put intelligent and kind. But I'll upset lots of people who think liberalism is something almost demonic. And that I think is a cultural version of the word liberalism. And of course, it's been attached to very deeply unpleasant political ideologies. But what I am understanding by liberalism, and what Ian Dunt refers to in his book, How to Be Liberal, which if you have a mind to read it, just read the first chapter. You'll see what it's about. If you don't like what it's saying in the first chapter, perhaps you might not want to go on and read the rest of it, but I thought it was a great book. That's one thing that this awful pandemic has allowed me to do, is spend time reading books. And I get very excited when I read a book like this, How to Be Liberal, and I want to write about it and talk about it because it makes sense and it is exciting. And I do think that the people that don't realize what the word means anymore. But I'm not, I didn't do a degree in political science. I have no great, I just read a book, and I have my opinions from looking at the world around me and my having lived to a certain age. So, when you do write, you always get somebody who knows loads about politics. So you don't know what you're talking about. I'm absolutely going to say, I do not know what I'm talking about, but what I do know is this, this, and this, and this. So I think the sort of bullying that can happen sort of to shut you up when you try and create an opinion you have to ride over that. But it is, any amount of sort of online bullying is pretty unpleasant. But when you say things which are slightly controversial, like I think people should read a book and have to be liberal, and I think being liberal is a great thing, that can chime very badly in some people's heads. But that's what I understand by being liberal. I haven't got the quick use of vocabulary or the vast knowledge of the political history of the last couple of centuries to be able to pull on, to be able to show you examples. But that doesn't mean I don't feel some of these things. I think that they're incredibly important. And some of the stuff you see going down, just to our government in Britain, the awfulness that's happening, the populism. I hope the populist experiment has failed. I really hope it has. But those sort of things I think are totally not liberal. And hopefully they're failing. But liberalism comes and goes, different political times. But I think it is having a resurgence at the moment in what I understand by liberalism. Anyway, so yes, in answer to your question, I think the word means very different things in different countries. And because America has such a loud voice that we in Britain very much hear, and their use of the word liberal is very different to ours. So, moving on back to...
Hey, Nick.
Hi, Michael.
It's almost 11.
Almost 11.
Probably time for one more question.
Okay, well,
okay.
I might try and squeeze a couple in. But
all right, yeah.
Just shut me down, cut me off when I've got over time. Okay, so I will be quicker. I'll try to be quicker in my answers. This one's from Glenn Burrows. I post this picture of the very, very beautiful Kirsten Owen, taken for the incredible designer Martin Sitvon under the art direction of the marvelous Mark Ascoli. And he writes, "Is there still some 10.8 polar in the world?" He means 10.8 Polaroid. Yeah, I have some, which I intend to use. But no, I don't really think they sell it anymore. If anybody knows they do, please send me the address, because it's a beautiful material. 10.8 Polaroid, the Polaroid that goes in the back of a 10x8 camera, or an 8x10 camera, as you say in America. Is a beautiful thing in itself. Paolo Roversi, great photographer from France, is made incredible images for Yohji Yamamoto in the 1980s by using 10.8 color Polaroid and cross-lighting it with gels and light and stuff. But it's just has a particular, it's a sort of creaminess to it, but yet a sharpness to it. It's a beautiful, beautiful medium. And then Paolo Roversi did a whole series of nudes, which some of you might be familiar with, by cross-processing. So you have color Polaroid and you have black and white Polaroid. And Polaroid comes in two halves. And you join the two halves, you expose one half, and the other half got all the chemicals in it. And you put it into the processor, and it switches all the chemicals through, and that's what makes the end Polaroid image. But you have a black and white version, a color version, and Paolo Roversi did the mixing of the two. So the chemicals from color and the actual thing you're exposed to the light from black and white. Very, very, very beautiful work. So I hope there's some more in the world. I frankly don't think there is. And this will probably have to be my last question, which is to do with the lovely, wonderful, and increasingly amazing Lady Gaga. I released this film for Dom Perignon, which was a minute long, and a lot of people wrote, please tell them, or wrote things equivalent to, and this is from somebody called ABELGRD, said, please tell me this is not just a teaser. It's the whole film. The film was a minute long for Dom Perignon, and just to show the intensity of work that goes into this. That minute for Dom Perignon, I worked on for a year with a team of people that I work on, the editors and colorists and everything else. So it's a bit like being Pixar, but with much less stuff. These things take a long time, and to get them to the level that I wanted it to be for the release for Dom Perignon, for Gaga. And yes, it's a minute long, but that's the commercial for Dom Perignon. But that one that Gaga was involved with, and I wanted it because of them and because of her, and because of the people who will see it, to be absolutely as best as I can possibly make it to be. It is only a minute long, but that took me a year. So anyway, all right, so I think that's probably the last question I have a chance to answer, because otherwise we'll go on and on and on. There's lots of topics we talk about, but I'll try and do them on my next AMA. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.